Hello, I'm Rupert Sheldrake. I'm here with Mark Vernon for another of our dialogues. Hello, Mark.
Hi there, Rupert. Hey.
Today, I hope we can talk about patron saints and saints in general. One reason I'm so interested in the topic is that, as you know, I'm a trustee of the Choral Evensong Trust, which promotes the service of choral evensong in cathedrals and churches. And so it doesn't promote the service itself, it makes it known when it's happening through the website, choralevensong.org. But this year, we're offering grants for patronal festivals in village churches, namely this festival of the patron saint. Each saint has a day, and the day of that saint is the patronal festival of the patron saint. Last year, 2025, we offered grants and we had 80 patronal festivals revived that had not happened for years, in most cases not within living memory, based on the service of choral evensong with a visiting choir if the church didn't have their own, followed by reception. And these were hugely successful. The churches were full, people loved it. There was a sense of community building. I went to several myself. They were wonderfully uplifting experiences. So this has really made me think more about what saints do and what they're like and what their role is. And I think part of it is that they're to do with protecting the place. You know, in the ancient world, people had spirits that protected the place. The Romans called it the genius loci, the spirit of the place. And Tibetans have protector spirits of places. In all traditions, you have the sense that there's a spirit or being protecting a particular place. And when England was Christianized, indeed when the whole of Britain and Ireland were Christianized, the local place, the role of the spirit protector of the place was taken by the patron saint. So each parish has a patron saint. A few, they're not exactly saints, they're aspects of God, like the Holy Trinity, or aspects of Christ, like Holy Redeemer or Christ Church. So each church has a feast of title of the saint or of the holy day, like Holy Trinity, Trinity Sunday. Anyway, on these saints' days, people have come together and celebrated the saint. And I think that honoring these saints is a very important thing because although they've been there, they're in the names of churches, you know, St. Mary Magdalene, St. John the Baptist, St. Michael and all angels. People just use them as a name and don't really make the most of it as a celebration of the saint. So I think one of the roles of the saints is indeed as protectors of the place. They're spirits of the place. Sometimes the saints are well-known international saints like St. Mark, your own patron saint, St. Matthew, St. John, etc. Sometimes they're very local saints, especially in Wales and Cornwall and the West. They were very local saints, often from the 6th or 7th century, sometimes hermits, holy men and women who founded a parish or were honored by a parish when it was established. And sometimes they have just one church dedicated to them because they're extremely local. Now, this practice of honoring the saints was abolished at the Reformation in England. They couldn't abolish the saints that are in the Bible, like St. Mark, St. Luke, St. John, etc. But all these Celtic and Cornish saints were nowhere mentioned in the Bible because they happened after the Bible and they were local and so on. So these were regarded as minor saints and disregarded, even though their name lived on as the protector of the parish. So I think reactivating the saints is very important. And I think that probably many of them are severely underemployed at the moment because no one bothers to pray to them or ask for their help. And I think by activating the saints, we can help activate and bring to life the sense of a spiritual dimension of the place in villages and towns throughout the land.
I very much like that. I'm actually speaking from a place nearby, a little village that I know quite well called Lurgashall in West Sussex. And I was visiting the church there, which is a very ancient church, and it's dedicated to St. Lawrence. So St. Lawrence was a fairly early Roman Christian martyr. And it made me think, how come this little village in Sussex is dedicated to St. Lawrence? And St. Lawrence, like it turns out, is quite a common dedication, actually, in England. There's hundreds of churches dedicated to St. Lawrence, sort of on a par to someone like St. Martin, for example. And St. Lawrence, the story goes, was martyred. Apparently he was very witty in his martyrdom. He was martyred on an iron grill above a fire and asked to be turned over in order to be cooked on the other side, as it were, a kind of grim sort of gallows humour, but has become associated in the way that patron saints often are with cooks and with comedy, but is also a Roman saint. And I think particularly in England, this links to what you were just saying there about an earlier part of the chapter with the local saints, particularly the local Celtic saints, so-called, in England, that when there was the settlement between the Catholic Church in Rome and the indigenous Christianity in these islands, often Roman saints became associated with churches in order to mark that settlement. I mean, this certainly happened with St. Martin of Tours, and I presume happens with St. Lawrence. But what that means now, I was thinking in relation to this little parish church in this village, which is probably a very old settlement, probably pre-Christian. It's on the Weald of Sussex. So it was in quite a terra incognita for a lot of history, it was very wooded, a rather lawless kind of place. Even though it's charming and pretty now. And I think that there must have been some kind of protector, saint, deity, spirit associated with that place. So it was a natural place to build a church as well. It's by a stream, a sort of river. So it's a sort of liminal space, you would say, as well. And I guess that St. Lawrence became associated with it because it was a way of Romanizing what had previously been there. I mean, nowadays, these stories are often told as if the church kind of seized places, overwrote them. But I suspect that it's much more organic than that there was a sense of a new dispensation for sure. And there had been a tussle between the Roman church and the Celtic church about things like the date of Easter, which is a seemingly obscure contention now, but it's about how heaven and earth meet, I think, in that, and how it's celebrated and brought together. So anyway, the point of saying all this is that I was in this little parish church that I know well. Feels like an ancient churchyard. It's quite circular. It's by a river. There's yew trees. But even the story of St. Lawrence helped me understand a little bit more about the place and made St. Lawrence that bit more relatable, actually. There is the way that he's the patron saint of cooks and the patron saint of comedy, which has a certain kind of wit to it. But it took me back through the presence of Lawrence to perhaps what happened there even before the Christian period. I feel that just that bit of inquiry into the local patron saint can help us connect with the land, with the place. I think this is a question that's quite current now in England. And there's a lot of talk at the moment about nationalism and about Christianity and about how these things come together, how they come together in reactionary ways, how they come together in productive ways. And it's often talked about in terms of values. What values do you hold? And there's something in that, but values often divide people because then you just get a pitched battle against, is it the value of belonging or is it the value of inclusion? But if you relate it through a person, then what you have is a kind of connection to the felt and living substance of the place. Much like people in their lives, for the most part, one way or another, hold maybe even competing values together. So I think relating to place through a life, through a person, enables a sort of deeper sense of connection, a deeper kind of rootedness. And this is one of the reasons why I was, glad that we decided to talk about this today, because I feel that that kind of matters now as well.
Yes. I think it's interesting that they're the patron saint of the whole parish, and that includes everything in the parish. It includes the land, the trees, the fields, the gardens, the footpaths, the animals that live there, and of course all the people that live there. So even if people don't identify as Christian, even if they identify as from some other religion or from no religion, or as spiritual but not religious, they're still under the protection of this saint. And I think this can be a really helpful thing to realize this. I've also been thinking a little bit about how saints work. I'm assuming that they do work. You could say the kind of rationalistic thing, well, this is just a fantasy in people's minds, and it may make them feel good to feel that some invisible friend is looking after them and so on. That would be the standard rationalistic way of thinking of it. But if one takes for granted the idea that there's survival of bodily death, and that saints are dead people who've chosen or been chosen to help the living, it means that they stay in contact with the living realm, with the people who are still alive, respond to their needs and requests, and help them. And it's interesting that to become a saint in the Roman Church, you have to have miracles, but you have to have miracles after you're dead. And I suppose the reason for that, posthumous miracles, is to show that you're still, in some sense, alive. I mean, after all, Christianity is about, among other things, about life after death. So if you're still alive and able to do something and able to interact with the world of the living, in that sense, it's a little bit like the bodhisattvas in Tibetan Buddhism. The aim of Buddhist and Hindu meditation is normally a kind of vertical takeoff from the world of suffering and reincarnation and samsara, things just going on and on and on. And the spiritual goal is you achieve liberation, or moksha, as the Hindus call it, from that by moving beyond the realm of reincarnation, the realm of remaining attached to this life and to this earth. So it's you, and you're absorbed into the greater consciousness that lies beyond all things. But Tibetan Buddhists, when they achieve the stage where they could be liberated, often undertake this bodhisattva vow, not to go into the Empyrean realms or the realms beyond, but to come back to help and serve those who are still living, to serve all sentient beings. And it seems to me that Christian saints may not necessarily, when they died, have intended to spend the next centuries or millennia helping people on earth rather than moving on. But they've been chosen to do so, and by being canonized, they've been charged with a duty that no doubt they feel they should discharge, of looking out for people, responding to their requests and prayers. And, it must be quite a burden being a saint, because most of us can just sort of get on with our afterlife without necessarily having to stay around a particular parish for centuries, dealing with all sorts of requests from people about lost cats and sick mothers and blessings on their children and blessings on the fields and on the crops and so on. They are actually performing the service, and some of them may have been slacking a bit recently because no one's called on them. But I think reawakening the saints is really quite an exciting idea.
I like that, what you're saying about unemployed saints looking for things to do. But actually, as you say that, you remind me of the way that Dante in the Paradise of the Divine Comedy describes meeting saints. So saints, part of the reason I think why in the Catholic Church there has to be miracles performed after death is that that's taken as a sign that the saint has good access to the communion of the saints, i.e., has a secure place in heaven. And Dante describes encountering various figures. Some of them are saints like St. Thomas Aquinas. Others are folk that he knew who were saintly. And they come to him at different levels of paradise. He, travels through the planetary spheres, through Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and so on. And different figures approach him at these different kinds of heaven. And at first Dante's a bit shocked because he says, how come you're not enjoying the fullness of the divine presence in the Empyrean, in the highest heavens? And what they tell him is that actually the different paths that they had led their lives through were all a path to the divine, but that particular path also enables them now to come to Dante to say, show him something about love in the heaven of Venus, if their path had been particularly defined by love, or to show Dante something about glory, the sphere of Mercury, if their paths had been particularly defined by glory, or to show him something about reason and the intellect, the heaven of the sun, if their paths had been particularly defined by that kind of brightness. So in other words, it's not that the saints are otherwise being held back from the divine presence, but it is the way they connect with us, which is also their connection to the divine presence, Dante would say. So pray to those saints and don't feel that they're being held back. But actually, I suppose that the more theological way of putting this, and I believe this is the case in the Bodhisattva vows as well, actually, is that there's something about fullness that's related to emptiness. And this is not a kind of scarcity emptiness, but it's an abundance where into all potential flows the kind of fullness that in theistic traditions would be called the divine fullness. And so there's something about the heavenly economy, you might say, where particularity and universality go together. And so the particular saint that you pray to, brings the whole of the divine presence, but you kind of need that point of need, if you like when you're praying for your lost cat or for the sick person that you love. That particular concern actually is a kind of opening into the divine whole, you might say. And then, and quite strange things can happen. I mean, maybe to make this a bit more tangible, and I've recently become very drawn to a particular representation of Mary. And you know about this, Rupert, because we've talked about it offline. But this is associated with a place called Broughton Hall, or Broughton Sanctuary, as it's now known, just outside Skipton in Yorkshire. And you and I have both been there, associated with the place. And I got very interested in a figure that we found together, actually, when we'd made a micro pilgrimage to the local parish church, which is dedicated to All Saints, but has in it 2 pre-Reformation statues of Mary, of Our Lady. And one is Mary as Theotokos, the Mother of God, quite a well-known image of Mary on a throne with the infant Christ in her lap. But another is less well known, certainly in Protestant Europe, which is known as Maria Lactans. And this is Mary breastfeeding Jesus. And I got very struck by this image. Well, we all were, but I decided to do a bit of research. And in a way, I now see the research as a kind of devotion, as a kind of prayer. And so I sort of partly tell this story to open the imagination of what a devotion to a particular saint might involve. It can involve kind of research, finding out about the place, about the story. And what I found out was that this image in statue form of Maria Lactans is very rare in English parish churches now, because most of them were destroyed at the Reformation. And there's actually only one other place where I found a record of a Maria Lactans statue. And so I was interested that at Broughton Hall, this seemed to be nearly unique. But this bit of research took me on quite a journey, because at one point, I happened to find myself quite by chance, because I'd taken the wrong turning off the drive actually to another visit at Broughton Hall. I found myself, when I was trying to find the way back onto the motorway, in the very village where this other Maria lactans is found. And it was quite a shock. But it was also as if my very practical bit of research was kind of being answered in some way, if only to be told through the synchronicity to kind of keep on this path. And then when I was back at Broughton, I took a small group of people on this little micro pilgrimage again to the parish church. And as I was trying to explain what this figure of Maria lactans might be like, I sort of knelt down before the figure, which is behind an altar. And I suddenly realized, what this figure was about, because when you kneel before the altar as if to receive the body of Christ, you're also receiving the milk of Mary, the body of Mary that comes through the Christ to us. And so this old bit of theology that the milk of Mary was identified with the blood of Christ and the body of Mary bore the body of Christ, and then we take these things into ourselves in the communion service. Suddenly this made very visceral sense to me as I was kneeling down, looking up, seeing the infant Christ, but then seeing Mother Mary behind. It was like a great flow of grace from the divine. So the point was that this seemingly obscure pre-Reformation statue opened up to me and spoke to me in a way that I would never have imagined when we noticed this. I mean, people in the place were drawn to the statue for their own reasons as well, actually. And maybe that's another wonderful thing about these patron saints and saints, is they can speak to us in multiple ways. But I've told this story to you before, but I suppose I rehearse it now again to foster this sense of what it might be like to reach out to a saint, and to see where it might take you.
Well, it's a wonderful story, Mark, and I hadn't heard this thing about kneeling down and the milk of Mary. No, that's a wonderful thing. It was also such a marvelous discovery of this lady chapel in this All Saints Broughton, because it's very unusual for a village church to have a lady chapel. They're common in cathedrals and in large churches. A special chapel for devotion to Our Lady. And particularly interesting was our host at Broughton Hall was the current owner of the family that's been there since 1066, Roger Tempest. And I did my own research and looked up the history, and as you know, found that the Lady Chapel with this statue was established in 1442 by Roger Tempest. I mean, the very same name, the very same family, which is an extraordinary connection across time. But one other aspect of patron saints that I'd like to touch on is name days, because many Christian names are the names of saints, like your name, Mark, and my name, Rupert. There's a Saint Rupert. He's the patron saint of Salzburg in Austria. So the many names, traditional Christian names, are saints' names, and every saint has his or her day, as we were discussing earlier. And so in Roman Catholic and in Orthodox countries, the name day of a person is really important. So everyone called Mark would celebrate St. Mark's Day in a Roman Catholic or Orthodox country. It's, in fact, in some cases more important than the birthday, your name day, whereas most people here pay no attention to their name day. I'm always reminded of mine by Brother David Stendhal-Rast, who's Austrian, who always sends me a lovely message on St. Rupert's Day, because it's my name day. I think this is something also that people might be interested in paying a little more attention to. And for example, the choral evensong, which we mentioned earlier, is this beautiful evening service that happens almost every day in all our cathedrals and during term time in Oxford and Cambridge College chapels. And they celebrate all these saints' days in the cathedrals. So on St. Mark's Day in all the cathedrals, they'd mention St. Mark. So what would happen if Marks all went to St. Mark's Day services, and Peters all went to St. Peter's Day services, and Madeleines went to St. Mary Magdalene Day services? I think it would be a really good way of reconnecting, not just with the saints as the protector of the place, but also of the protector of people who are named after them. Every time one says the name Rupert or Mark, one's also saying a name that resonates with all the other people called Rupert and Mark, and ultimately to the prototype of these names, namely the saint, who forms the kind of prototype, the name after which all these people are named, and all of us are named. Now, there are some people who aren't named after saints, so then there'd have to be a special day or days for those who don't have a particular saint. Maybe All Saints' Day would include unnamed saints or precursors of names. But I think if we pay attention to the saints in a way that traditionally people have done in Roman Catholic and Orthodox countries, we still have that tradition in the Anglican Church because we still observe the saints' days, although with less so than in other churches, and we still have the patron saints. But I think reviving this interest in the saints does help us connect with spiritual beings who are less than God, but are much closer to ordinary everyday life. And it's interesting, even in Buddhist countries like Sri Lanka, most Buddhists don't feel that they can bother the Buddha, who is portrayed as being sublime and serene, in the statues. He's utterly serene and not concerned with worldly problems. He's gone beyond all that. So a lot of Buddhists feel they don't want to bother the Buddha with their everyday requests, to pass exams, for their business to succeed, for their child to get better if they're sick, and so on. So surrounding Buddhist temples in Sri Lanka, there are a whole series of shrines to various Hindu gods, Murugan, Kali, Lakshmi, and so on. And these gods all have their areas of particular speciality. Lakshmi is the goddess of wealth, for example. So if it's about money and you have problems, you'd ask Lakshmi. And then Ganesh is the remover of obstacles, and so on. So each of these has their particular role, and these are still prayed to because they're closer to the everyday realm, and people don't want to bother the Buddha in his serene meditation with their mundane problems. And I think there's something of that also in the Christian tradition with saints. And saints have specialized roles. St. Anthony of Padua in the Roman Church is the patron saint of lost objects. So if you lose something, you go and pray to St. Anthony, light a candle, and many people swear by it, and they find what they've lost. St. Jude is the patron saint of lost causes, very popular in poor parishes in Chicago, for example. And so there are all these patron saints. So not only the place, not only the name, but also with their various specialized roles. And I think it's particularly interesting that probably the saint most prayed to of all is the Blessed Virgin Mary. In the Hail Mary, one of the things she's prayed to for is help at death. So she's not only gives birth as the great mother, but she's also the mediator of death. And this is an ancient role of goddesses. Goddesses were both the source of life and also the taking away of life. The womb is the tomb. It's an ancient role of feminine archetypes. And we have that in the Hail Mary, which I personally say every day. The bottom line of the Hail Mary is, Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. So Amen. So it ends with the word death, and it's the idea of asking for her help as we're dying, as a kind of midwife of the dying process. And of course, when we're dying, we probably need all the help we can get in that transition, one of the most important transitions of our lives, the moment of death. And again, there's this role of a specialist saint for that, in this case, the Blessed Virgin Mary, to help us in the actual process of dying.
Yeah, I think of Mary too as the patron saint of contemplatives, of silence, because, and this again is in Dante, that her sort of dying to herself was that which enabled the Christ to be born in her. You know, she famously says, "Be it unto me according to thy word." And this is one of the great prayers, I think, of Christianity and other traditions, which is "Thy will be done." And that it's related to what you're saying, the hour of our mortal death, because death can then become part of life, as well as something that frames mortal life. There's a richness to these saints, which is very wonderful. And I think another facet of this is how saints can connect us to the seasons, and to the natural world, like you were saying. So, for example, my name's Mark. I write books, and so sometimes think of Mark, the gospel writer, in my own writing. But also, I was born actually on Saint Nicolas's Day, and the 6th of December. And my second name actually is Nicholas, as a result of that. And I like that because Saint Nicholas is known for generosity, for gift giving in life. And so in many countries, it's on Saint Nicholas's Day that you give the gifts of Christmas, Father Christmas and so on as well, of course. But it feels that that's related to the season too, because it's at that point in the year when we're just a couple of weeks off the winter solstice. And so we've entered that time where night seems to be almost encroaching completely on the day. It's that pause, that moment where there's much more darkness than there is light. And that's a moment in which to think of the generosity of the light, to give some gifts, to, you might say, be in touch with an inner light, even as the light of the world around us, in the northern hemisphere at least anyway, is so constrained. And that, I think, must relate to, my first deeply embodied experiences of this world. I was born on that day, when the darkness was much more present than the light. And so calling on the saint of that day helps me to, connect with something that I think must have deeply shaped me, that's also in the natural pattern of things, in the season of things. That particular day has a kind of resonance for me. Maybe there's parallels here with what people turn to astrology for as well, of course. But it has a kind of felt resonance, the day that I was born, the relationship of light to dark on that day, but how there's a wider cycle, wider pattern that St. Nicholas helps me relate to because of this generosity that's associated with the saints, even in the darkness of the year. There's a wonderful way in which the saints bring worlds together, not by moving to some sort of abstract, general, disincarnate way of life, but precisely through the way that all life is incarnate for us, it brings in the more. And I think actually this relates back to, the very notion of saints. I mean, I mentioned St. Lawrence earlier on. He is a martyr. Many of the first Christian saints were martyrs, and that's partly because of the heroism of their life and their death. But heroism wasn't just being admirable in the ancient world. To be a hero was to be a figure that brought heaven and earth close together. The heroes in the pre-Christian world were celebrated because they were admired by the gods for what they were enabled to do, even in their mortality. the one thing that a mortal person can do that a god couldn't was to give their life for for the witness towards others, for the good of others. And in fact, I remember traveling around Greece and the Middle East a bit, and quite a lot of Christian churches, the first ones were built on the site of pre-Christian heroes, which also had their shrines. And because they were seen as places where a person had brought heaven and earth close together. And so to go to those places was where heaven and earth touched. But again, through the particularity of the story, through the particularity of the place. So yeah, I feel like saints, returning to the saints in their particularity, it's something we need to do now. It's a kind of re-enchantment of the world, I suppose, is what I'm saying, and what you're talking about as well. The saints can be called on to help us, and they do bring revelations, but they also help us, I think, to know all day, every day, in a re-enchanted kind of way, through a kind of affective relationship with them, but also through a curiosity about their story, about why they became associated with the place, about what they might bring. So this is all to celebrate the patron saints, like we're saying.
Very good, Mark. Well, it's interesting. Saint Nicholas is probably one of the most celebrated because he is, of course, Santa Claus, Saint Nicholas, Klaus. So, incidentally, the winner of the Patronal Festival of the Year award this year was St. Nicholas, Kittisford, the smallest village in Somerset, which had the most wonderful Patronal Festival for St. Nicholas. It's interesting that he was the one that shone out most. And I thought they'd have the least chance of being successful because it's so near Christmas. But it turned out to be a hugely successful Patronal Festival. Good. Well, I'm so pleased we've had a chance to discuss this and bring together some of these threads of which we've both been thinking about. And I hope this is helpful to other people in thinking about their patron saint of their own name, if they have a name that has a saint as its patron, or of their place. And everyone has a place with a patron saint, whether they're aware of it or not. So it can be important, and I think it is.
Well, I remember too your habit, Rupert, when you arrive in a place, to go to the holy spot in that place, the sacred place in that spot, often the church, of course, and if possible to light a candle or maybe circumambulate the holy place, but to arrive in it spiritually as well as physically. So it feels like we've been doing some of that invocation even in our discussion now. So thank you very much.